Welcome to Inside the Lab with the CMBC, Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture. I'm Lynn Nygaard, the director of the center, and we're so fortunate today to have a conversation with Lauren Klein, who's an associate professor in the Department of English and in the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods here at Emory University. And you direct the Digital Humanities Lab here at Emory. And I wanted to just start by asking if you would say a bit about yourself. I've introduced you as the associate professor, but where are you coming from, and how did you get to Emory, and when did you arrive at Emory?
Thank you so much. It's really, I'm honored that you would take the time to talk with me and share this with the CMBC. How did I get here? I feel like there's a short answer and there's a really long answer.
Yeah, either one is great.
So I came, most directly, physically from Georgia Tech, so really just down the road. So I've lived in Atlanta and I've taught in Atlanta for this point since 2011. So I don't know how many years that is, but it's a lot. And I came to Georgia Tech with a PhD in English, but having worked in software development before going to grad school. And initially, I think I was hired to teach sort of literary type material to technical undergrads, and they liked that I was nerdy myself. But I quickly sort of over the initial years realized that the way to reach technical students was to sort of show them how some of the approaches that they already used in other classes could be applied to more literary and cultural questions. And conveniently, sort of all around me, as I was sort of inhabiting the shift as in my own research as well, this field called digital humanities started to coalesce. And the field is all about how you can take computational methods and sort of questions surrounding the digital more generally and apply them to humanistic research, and actually also the other way around. So how you can sort of take a humanistic approach and apply it to understanding technical things and digital infrastructure and things like this. And so just over the years, my research sort of shifted away from a traditional sort of disciplinary pursuit to something that I thought was pretty weird. I mean, I guess generously you'd call it interdisciplinary, but I was in an interdisciplinary department where we were brought together by the fact that each person did something different.
Yes.
And, a couple of years ago, I'd heard that Emory, was the QTM, then an institute, Quantitative Theory and Methods, was really gathering steam. And you may even know more about this than me, but they launched a major. And in the past couple of years, it's become rapidly one of the most popular majors for undergrads. And they were thinking about all of the ways that they could connect with undergrads, not just in the social sciences, which I think is sort of the bread and butter combination of quantitative theory and methods, but also in the humanities. And so there was a search for this position, someone who could bring together quantitative methods with English, and that's what I do. And conveniently, I didn't even have to move. That never happens.
Right. It's great, right? So you just, sort of park in a different parking garage.
I go left instead of right for my commute right now. So.
Yeah. I'm interested in, and you've talked a little bit about what digital humanities is, but it's really an interesting example of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. And so one, and I should mention that in 2017, you were named a rising star in digital humanities by the Inside Higher Education. So congratulations. So well qualified to answer these questions, but how do you determine where the intersections, what questions in the humanities or what that are going to be amenable to these kinds of quantitative techniques, or are all questions presumably or amenable to those kinds of techniques, and vice versa? How is the humanities allowing you to interpret and visualize and ask the right questions of a data set?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I would say there's no, sort of single answer. But I will say that there's this big debate, like, is digital humanities a field? Is it its own thing? Can you get a degree in digital humanities? And I think what's been borne out time and time again is that while you can train yourself up in certain sets of methods or approaches, and this is true of any field,
Mm-hmm.
you really need to have deep domain expertise in order to know both what questions are interesting ones to ask, and then
Right.
what methods are appropriate for for that
Right.
question.
Right.
And what that ends up leading to is people who really need to have expertise in two different areas. And it doesn't need to be equal expertise, right? There are
Right.
um, people involved in digital humanities, or DH as it's often called,
Mm-hmm.
who have a sort of a very broad sense of all the possibilities, and sort of have a great ability to say this type of research or this type of project needs this type of approach. And then they bring in
Right.
a team who can sort of help them build that
Right.
out. And then
Right.
there's also methods people who, are expert mappers, or make amazing apps, or do these
Right.
quantitative type things. And when you, as the researcher, sort of have an inkling that this is the path you want to go down, you can bring in someone with more expertise. So I would say, in addition to it being interdisciplinary, it's also very collaborative. And that's
Yes.
actually one of the things that I think makes it most different from other humanities disciplines. I mean, that's changing a little. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I would
Mm-hmm.
say more, a lot of different humanities scholars, and even the social sciences too, have a wide range of methodological approaches in their
Sure.
toolkit,
Yeah.
and sometimes, approach current issues, or sort of take their lens and apply it to a different sort of a question outside of their domain. But this is something that's actually been really reinforced, having moved from Georgia Tech to Emory, is that the collaborative aspect of the work and the publications
Mm-hmm.
and the types of projects that you do is pretty unusual for the humanities. I would
Yeah.
say still. Not that I actually don't think it should be. I love collaborative work. I find it really rewarding, especially working with students and working with
Mm-hmm.
colleagues in other institutions and things like that. But it happens far less than I think it should.
Right, right. And that brings me to, I'm curious about the challenges. I mean, when you're interacting with your colleagues, and I'm gonna do a dichotomy here that's not um, uh, sort of as a straw person, I guess, but you have your colleagues in the humanities. What are the challenges with communicating to them about these kinds of quantitative approaches and the validity, or the usefulness and of those kinds of approaches? So bringing sort of that over to the humanities side, and what are the challenges going the other direction? And again, I'm setting these up as, rather than being sort of integrated as being this versus that, but what are the challenges with talking to your colleagues on both, sort of from both realms or
Yeah,
disciplines?
that's such a good question. And it's something that comes up a lot. I wouldn't say it's not necessarily that there are challenges, but I do think
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of this work involves sort of extra work, in that some of the research that takes place under the auspices, especially of collaborative projects, sort of isn't necessarily legible to scholars outside those fields. So like when you're, and this actually, I can give an example in a minute
Yeah.
about a project that I'm working on right now. But in literary studies, which is the field in which I was trained, you need to, for your scholarship to make a valid contribution to the discipline, you need to be engaged in current conversations taking place about either, the text that you're writing about, the issue, the time period, or whatever. And it doesn't really matter that you spent 2 years developing a new method that will allow you to
Mm-hmm.
extract the information that then becomes part of that argument. You just
Right.
need the argument and to be able to articulate its
Right.
contributions, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the flip side, when speaking to more technical fields, the method, sort of the innovation in terms of method, is what matters. And
Right.
it's much less important whether or not it makes a new and relevant and impactful contribution to the humanities. So you often
Right.
find, I increasingly am trying to sort of present the same work to two different audiences,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so different, sort of the parts of the project that you present, depending on what field you're speaking to. But
Right.
it's also pretty interesting. I mean, but there's also interesting sort of disciplinary conventions that
Mm-hmm.
I increasingly am sort of, not surprised by at this point, but I sort of smile when I encounter them. Like I'm working on this project right now, that has to do with 19th century abolitionist newspapers. And so these were newspapers that are one of the most essential records of the abolitionist movement of the 19th century United States. So the movement to end slavery. And they're interesting because they are multiracial. So there were newspapers that were edited by white editors for white audiences, by Black editors for Black audiences, for mixed audiences by mixture of people. There's also issues of gender that show up. There is newspapers that were intended to appeal to try to win over the ladies kind of thing. And so it's this really interesting, it's a big data set. We have these, 300,000 newspaper articles or something like that. And I'm working with a colleague of mine in computational linguistics to try to model the network structure of this paper on the basis of the text. And so for the humanities, so we have this pretty sophisticated model. We have these really interesting findings for the 19th century. And we were talking about what we would need to make the paper get accepted to the tippy top natural language processing conference.
Yeah.
And my collaborator said, well, I think you need a more contemporary application. And I thought, great, well, right now we're seeing the rise of another abolitionist movement, right, with Black Lives Matter and the movement towards abolishing the police and prisons and things like this. These are directly connected. I bet we could do a really interesting comparison where we draw parallels between then and now. And he said, oh, that is really interesting, but we couldn't do the same topic. For a paper to be accepted at, ACL or whatever, we would need an entirely different application to prove that the method really worked. And to me, that would, I appreciated the clarity, but the assessment that the method wouldn't be valid unless you could find the most different application that you could find. That exact choice would make it less valid for a humanities audience, right?
Right. So it's an abstract construction in some ways, right? It's a method that should be applied to any kind of data set. And you're thinking about connections between, this movement and that movement.
Exactly. And it was just so interesting because it was just two different definitions of validity that were disciplinary and were fundamentally, you couldn't have both at the same time, right? And so it was just a really interesting moment for me. And things like that happen intermittently.
Yeah, at the center we are interested in this kind of interdisciplinary. How do we get disciplines at least to be able to talk to one another or appreciate the methods of one another, and ideally to have something that's not just cross-discipline but interdisciplinary, or there are lots of words now for these kinds of integrations. So thank you for the example, because I'm really, I wanted to talk about your particular projects as well. And this is called, this project that you just were talking about, Vectors of Freedom, is that right?
Tentatively, yeah.
Tentatively, yeah.
We work.
Yeah, and so I was interested because both you were looking at this corpus of 19th century newspapers, and you described a little bit about the characteristics of that corpus, and but then I did notice that you're collaborating, or in conversation at least, with a project at Delaware that's looking at kind of personal stories or things that might not have made it into print. Right. Could you talk about that kind of, that tension or that juxtaposition or collaboration?
Sure. So I'd say, it's not my project. I've contributed very little to this project, but I think it's an amazing project. And I am, and among the contributions of this particular project, it's called the Colored Conventions Project. And it was run by a team of students and faculty in this very sort of interesting and equitable structure. And they have, for the past, at this point, 8 years, scoured the archive, newspapers, physical archives, online text searches, going to local churches, things like this, trying to find meeting minutes of these 19th century in-person organizing meetings that took place
Interesting.
over the
Yeah.
course of the 19th century that were attended by Black Americans, both free and fugitive, in which this group strategized about how to achieve really sort of wide-ranging liberation. So, the end to slavery, but also racial justice more broadly, economic justice, educational justice, things like this. And it's a really important aspect of the 19th century. It points to the ways in which, as contemporary scholars, the stories we tell about the past are heavily influenced by what sources we have access to, right? It's like, I went to these abolitionist newspapers. I began working with them in 2013 or 2014 because I thought to myself, like, where do you find information about abolition? Oh, it's in these newspapers. And then you can go to these large digitized archives and search for them and find them. And then if you want to do more large scale work, you need to do some, have some negotiations with the provider to get the corpus.
Right.
But, that's just the natural path. But as a result, the story that historically has been told about abolition sort of centers and affirms the contributions of, for the most part, white abolitionists who also, edited these newspapers, and doesn't tell the story of these Black abolitionists who were working in parallel and often in conversation, but whose stories, because they were literally oral, and there were these transcripts, but they didn't necessarily, they take a little bit of a different form. So you don't know exactly always what was spoken, but you do know that they were happening. And so I was really, I was fascinated by this, and the project has done an amazing job of making the corpus which they've assembled accessible. And, part of their argument is that more people need to know about this movement and assimilate it into the larger conversation about abolition and how, social movements work, which is in large part not about newspapers and a lot more about, showing up and building relationships and forming communities and things like this. And I actually was fortunate to be able to teach with the corpus this past semester. I guess in the fall. The spring has sort of merged into it.
Yeah.
I don't know what that semester was.
We'll
in the
set
fall,
that aside a little bit. Yeah.
And so I did spend some time exploring the corpus from a quantitative perspective and found some really interesting things. And one of the long-term goals of my abolitionist project is to try to connect this sort of large newspaper corpus to this smaller but equally important sort of this corpus of transcripts, and see if I can somehow try to amplify the significance of what is contained in these transcripts with like the textual, the broader context for what was going on. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I'm hoping to sort of involve more of the project team involved in producing the Color Conventions corpus as I move forward.
I want to make sure that but there were, you have so many interesting projects, but I wanted to touch on another one of them, the Data by Design project. And is that, you received a Mellon Fellowship for Digital Publication, an NEH Mellon Fellowship I guess, fund this research. Is that correct? Yeah. Looking at the history of data visualization. And what are some major themes in that project?
Thank you for asking about this one. This is a project I'm so excited about this one. I'm returning to it after sort of a pause. So this project, it has sort of two inspiration points and sort of two major themes. And one is, if you look at data visualization today, or if you just think about it, first of all, it's everywhere. Think of like the COVID tracker, or, how your credit card statement gives you a little pie chart of your spending each month or whatever, they're everywhere. But also they're all kind of the same. And they all kind of have, or for the most part, have a similar sort of minimal aesthetic, where the goal is presenting you sort of a simple, clear view of the bigger picture so that you can take a quick look and you immediately understand some sort of larger, more complex thing. And I was interested in that, and I was sort of interested in how that view of what visualization should both look like and also do sort of came to be the only idea of what visualization should look like and do. And this was actually, this thinking was prompted by some of the archival work that I had done a long time ago, actually relating to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson didn't visualize data in a technical sense, but he was very much a visual thinker. And he also had incredibly problematic, by which I mean sort of racist and violent views of what constituted data. I mean, he treated the people he enslaved as data, essentially. Right. That's what he did. And so I had been working on this project that was trying to think through sort of these regimes of control that he enacted by classifying people, people with names and lives and family members, and sort of deliberately condensing these rich experiences into these notebooks that he kept and that have been studied a lot, not just by me, by a lot of people. And I did some research and I discovered that his favorite teacher at the College of William and Mary had been the person who had gone on, he had come over from Scotland in the late Enlightenment, and had trained Thomas Jefferson and then had to go back. And his next pupil was the person who many historians of data visualization, such as there, but there are like three. The people,
all of them, lots of them.
Yeah, lots of them. But there is a single person who nerds on the internet tend to identify as the father of modern data visualization. And right after Thomas Jefferson, his professor taught this guy. And so to me, and then this guy went on to invent the pie chart, to invent the bar chart, perfect the time series, like the line graph. And so I was just thinking, like, these things have to be connected, this way of thinking, this sort of narrow definition of Enlightenment humanism and who constitutes a human. This has to come from somewhere, and it has to be carried over into these other visual forms. And so this sent me down actually a lot of archival research, where I went looking, in the late 18th century and early 19th century at, all of the ways in which people were visualizing data. And I found that, sure enough, people really did understand the act of visualization as an intentional technique of conveying an argument, whether it was about sort of controlling the chaos, the political chaos, or what they perceived to be political chaos. I mean, other people would say it was revolution, right? But, like the earliest data visualizations came about right in the middle of the Age of Revolution. So the US Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, and they were mostly created by European men who sort of wanted to cut through the instability and the confusion and sort of make current events tractable. They wanted control over what seemed to them to be this uncontrollable situation. And they're explicit about it. They write, and the other thing is, like, now we just get the pie chart and we know what it means, but when they were new, you had to have a chapter that explained, what it was you were looking at. So all of these images come with these very detailed accounts of what they were trying to do. And you have certain people choosing clarity, cleanliness, the condensation of complexity into a single image very intentionally, and sort of in a way that is politically situated. And then by the same token, you have other people who recognize the power of visualization to sort of grant authority and enable knowledge production. And sort of, if you defer the meaning making to the viewer, then you can actually empower viewers to themselves create knowledge or interpret a less clear image or engage in a process of cross-referencing or, whatever it is. And these designs, they're deeply strange to us. Like, they look really weird. One that I talk about a lot looks just like a Mondrian painting, but it's from the 1850s. And I was just very curious about, what this told us about knowledge production and how sort of the dominant narrative had influenced sort of these just accepted truths about what constitutes knowledge and how we produce knowledge and what's good and clear and knowledge and why good and clear is better. And so, yeah, so that's a sort of a long rambling answer, but I'm excited about this project. I'm in it, as you can tell.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but then just to sum it up quickly, the reason why it got that fellowship is that I decided that the project should not be a traditional monograph, but should actually be a web-based publication, so that I could both include images of all the visuals, the archival images that I was talking about, but also recreate a lot of these historical visualizations with contemporary tools, so that visitors to the site could sort of play around with them. So,
Right.
so
Right.
that's what I'm working on right now, actually, with the students still from Georgia Tech, although I'm looking to hire some Emory students. I was going to hire them in the fall, but I'm not sure how that's going to work with online instruction. But yeah, I'm looking to sort of get the team back together now that I moved over to Emory to continue making work on this project.
I might not be uh, characterizing this correctly, but is one of the ideas that the way that sort of the data visualization emerged, or historically, or was manipulated actually by the data visualizers, kind of changed the way we think, or was intended to change the way we think about particular issues? It's certainly to make an argument, but is there a way that it kind of constrained thinking? And so obviously they're trying to make an argument, but did that then sort of, is there an iterative process where we have trouble thinking about things outside of pie charts, if you will, if that's the dominant kind of visualization that we sort of get as a consumer, you
I
know?
mean, I do think, sort of from my contemporary perspective, I do think this has led to a general sort of lack of uh, data, sort of visual or data literacy, for lack of a better term. You know, we trust visualizations to be true because they appear to be sort of
Yes.
true and accurate, right? You know,
Right.
so and there's the interesting, like in the field of sort of visualization research, they do studies
Right.
where they do things like, you know, show people a pie chart and then show them one with just a source colon fake URL. And people
Right.
think, you know, think the one that has the source line is
Yeah.
more reputable. I mean, people really respond to these images rhetorically. And I think because the dominant mode of visual presentation was intended to eliminate complexity and say, look, all you need to do is look at this image and you will understand.
Right.
I think viewers do have a tendency to be less critical of what they are seeing and ask, like, well, what did the data really show? How were the
Right.
data collected? What are the methods here? You know, and that's the
Right.
kind of, you know, in general in my work, I never want the takeaway to be like, we can't trust science, or we can't trust data, or, you know, there's no ground truth here. What I always want people to do is to be asking tougher questions about the information that they receive, so they
Right.
understand more about both what it's telling them, but then also what it's not telling them. And so they don't
Right.
come to conclusions that are beyond the scope of a particular project. And so I do think that sort of a bad legacy of this sort of dominant Enlightenment strain of visualization
Mhm.
is the sort of instinctual acceptance of some sort of clean looking visualization as the truth, or the complete picture, or something like that.
Right, right. Really interesting. I think I would be remiss, and I'm not sure how you're doing all this, Lauren, but you have two new books. Is that correct? Or recent books, right?
I do,
So
I do.
yeah, so please tell us a little bit about these two books. And they're sort of a very different in data feminism and then an archive of taste. Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, if they, you know, all of these, I have a very, I like to, as you can see, I like doing a lot of different things at the same time. And the result for a long time was that nothing was finished. But now I've reached the point where many things are approaching completion at the same time. And so this is what
mm,
you're seeing. So the Data Feminism Project actually it's probably, of anything that I've been working on, it's probably the thing that started most recently and also finished most recently. And it's a general audience book about what intersectional feminism can bring to data science, essentially, you know, acknowledging that data right now carries a huge amount of power in the world and
yeah,
potency. And that power right now is wielded very unequally, you know, by large corporations, by institutions, by people who have the capacity, whether technical or economic to collect data, right, and process it and make sense of it. And then there's a vast disparity between sort of those people who are wielding the data and the people about whom the data is collected. You see this right now with all of the conversation around facial recognition software, right?
Yes, right.
And so, you know, the connection that we try to make in the book is to say, look, like data carries all this power and it's unequal power. And you know what? There's this rich history of feminist thinking, and in particular, intersectional feminist thinking and activism that has taught us how to identify and then rebalance these unequal power relations that we encounter in the world. And so that actually makes it sound more theoretical than it is. It's intended to be a trade book. It's written for a general audience. We have 7 principles of data feminism. It's co-authored with a colleague of mine at MIT, Catherine D'Ignazio. And it's really intended to, it's very example driven. We really want people to sort of do better and more equitable data science, and to not just have like a vague aspiration of doing good, but to say like, okay, I'm ready to do it. How do I do it? What are some steps I can take? And so we give these 7 different principles, which are each sort of a different way into structuring a data-driven project. So that one was, it's super fun to write. You know, it's actually much more challenging to try to distill a really complicated thinking into sort of like clear and jargon-free language, and to try to find peppy examples from the internet that illustrate these points, you know, than it is to sort of assume a common understanding of, you know, 40 years of intellectual history.
Yes, indeed.
So yeah, but that project is, it's out in print, and actually the open access edition will be released, I believe, next week. So it'll be free online. The print book is like, it's large format. It has a lot of nice images in it, but if you are curious, or if any of the listeners are curious, they should be able to find it. The other book is called An Archive of Taste. And that was the culmination, actually began as my dissertation. You know, it's a very disciplinary, or not, you know, I try to be a little bit interdisciplinary in it, but you know, it's a book, it's a scholarly book for scholars. It talks about eating, the phenomenon of eating, and how if you're interested in eating in a historical way, you sort of immediately run into a problem, and that you can't get direct access to these experiences, right? Like if you're interested in poetry or drama, or, you know, even in some cases, sound, you know, there's all of these other aesthetic experiences that we have much, if not direct access to, much closer access to some sort of record that gives us a sense of, you know, what those experiences were like in a previous era. But with eating, you don't have that. And so the book is a little bit about sort of methods and thinking through the approaches that we can take to the archive in order to try to, not to sort of, you know, not to ever access, because that can't happen, but to sort of do things with the fragments that we do have, and to try to sort of build up a narrative that sort of holds this, like essentially just tell a good story that holds the space for the archival or historical information that we do not know. And so that, and it sort of,
yeah,
no,
sorry. So what's like an example of something that was surprising to you, or a way that you were able to, you know, sort of bring to in an experiential way, or at least approximate that for some kind of eating, right? Or eating experience, right?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, so, and this is, I was going to say, like, there's sort of a second strand of this, which has to do with the history of slavery. And it actually comes back to Thomas Jefferson too, who looms large in my scholarship. But, you know, so Thomas Jefferson often, well, again, you know, nerds on the internet often describe him as the founding foodie. He was really into food, or so the narrative goes. But if you scratch the surface only a little, you discover that while he happily ate food and promoted it in his writing and at his dinner table, all of the food that he served, that he really viewed, and he is explicit about this, as emblematic of all of these Republican ideals, you know, equality, opportunity, abundance, all of these things. It was cooked by men and women he enslaved. And there's an individual named James Hemings, who is Sally Hemings' older brother, who Jefferson while he was enslaved, took with him to France when Jefferson went there to be minister to France, and essentially, in effect, apprenticed James Hemings to the chef of a former prince. So he had this sort of high French culinary training. While he was in the kitchen, he learned to speak and write fluent French. He could also read and write in English very well, which was not always true for enslaved people at that time. And so this man who had very clear and culinary knowledge at the highest level available at that time. And so this actually began very early in the book. I was like, oh, this is the person I want to write about. He's the source of all of these things that I want to say about why eating matters and why food matters for the nation's cultural foundation. But when you go looking for archival information about James Hemings, there's very little. And this is because he was a man who Jefferson enslaved. And Jefferson, while Jefferson himself was fairly meticulous, and some would even say sort of obsessive about keeping a copy of every single letter he wrote, every single sales receipt, he himself accumulated a vast archive, so something like, it's approaching 100,000 documents that Jefferson himself saved. And yet there are, maybe a handful, I should know the exact number, but it's something like 30 documents that even mention James Hemings in passing. And even then it's like by first name, or he was called Gimet while in France. So you can't even do a keyword search and find all of them.
Right.
And then ultimately, James Hemings, there's this really interesting story about how Hemings attempted first unsuccessfully and then successfully to negotiate for his freedom, which Jefferson granted. And then Hemings ultimately sort of disappears from history, but later is found dead. And scholars think that he committed suicide or had something there was some sort of situation which led to his death. It was not not of natural causes. And it was this encountering the story and sort of piecing it together through all these fragments. There were so many questions that I had. There was so much that I wanted to know, and I will never know those things. There are no records of them. We can only, to say not, and this is just of the logistics, right? To say nothing of the emotional, the inner state of Hemings as he was encountering these major life transitions. And it just sort of set me thinking, both about sort of, the limits of the archive, but also, to me, there seemed to be sort of an ethical imperative to sort of do justice to his story, to sort of give him the story that he deserved, give him the role that he deserved in the telling of this history. And in order to do that, you can't just do a traditional, historical approach where you run through all of the facts that you have about this person, because that isn't enough. So anyway, so it's people like that, and they're, unfortunately, Hemings is probably the most central and the most compelling person who I talk about in the book, but there is a whole history, especially of our country's presidents enslaving Black men to perform their cooking, and then making that cooking be highly emblematic of all sorts of things associated, all sorts of ideals associating with our country that are not actually lived, right? And so there's a couple of people who I talk about in the book where there are echoes of James Hemings' story in that.
Really, really important work, and really, really interesting. And that book came out from University of Minnesota Press pretty recently, is that as well?
Yeah, and there's also an open access version of that too, actually, thanks to Emory's open scholarship program.
Fantastic. Well, I know I've been just putting you through your paces here, for quite some time, but I just wanted to mention a couple of other things. One is that you edit, as if this weren't enough, you edit a blog entitled Debates in Digital Humanities with Matthew Gold. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's actually it's a book series, but it's also
a book series. That's right. Yeah. Is it based on blogging, or is it a book series?
It's
Yeah.
a book. It's a book series. It comes out in
Mhm.
books. Oh, if I were at my physical office, I could show one to you.
Yeah.
But we do. One of the things we do try to do is create a space for documenting and publishing what we call sort of uh, gray material. You know,
Mhm.
so things that exist in this liminal space between formal scholarly articles and an off the cuff remark. There are
Ah,
really interesting conversations that do happen in blogs and on Twitter and in interview style formats and
yep.
things like this. And so we are pretty intentional about the range of material that we publish. But that comes out every couple years, and we're
Yeah.
actually in the middle of preparing the manuscript for the volume that will come out in 2022.
Yeah, and this has been, you have several volumes at this point, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. The
really
series at this point
interesting.
is 10 years old.
Ah, wow. Well, congratulations. Well, really, really interesting. So you're doing online teaching maybe this fall. And what are you teaching this fall? Um,
So I'm not teaching this fall because I'm on
uh,
leave with a fellowship.
oh,
Yeah,
congratulations.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I am looking forward in the future to a couple of things. One is that this past spring, I taught the first iteration of a class on feminist data science
Hmm.
within QTM, where I was trying to take those principles that I mentioned, sort of relating to data
Yeah.
feminism, but actually sort of more narrowly apply them to the type of work that QTM students sort of are trained to
Hmm.
do and will go on to do in their careers,
Yeah.
and trying to approach that with an equity lens. And so that was really fun. And I think the next version will be a lot better. And then the other thing that I'm trying to do is bring some of these issues in a slightly less technical way to the English department,
Yeah.
and develop a series of courses that will introduce humanities students to digital humanities and the possibilities, with the hope that they may go on to learn a bit more in the area of quantitative
Yeah.
methods. They might not, but in either case, they'll sort of have a sense of where humanistic approaches can really enhance some of the work being done in this area.
Right, right. They'll have a vocabulary and
Mhm,
a
mhm.
and an understanding of the scope. Well, Lauren, thank you so much. I know I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about your really interesting research, and we're so lucky to have you at Emory.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much. Thank you for including me. I am looking forward to the time when we can congregate in
and
person.
see, right? Yeah, actually see one another in person. Yeah.
I know.
Um, so thank you. And I think.